How's it going, everybody? I am ZBilbs and I'm back here today with another metal albums ranked video. Now, better late than never, but I'm finally getting back to re-ranking the now 19 Judas Priest albums with the release of their brand new Invincible Shield. Now, I've already ranked these guys about a little over a year ago, so check out my previous video, but my thoughts have changed a considerable amount, so I decided to update my ranking with the inclusion of the new album. Also, my other video was about like 40 minutes long because there's so much to go into when it comes to Judas Priest. I'm going to try to keep it a little bit more concise this time. Hopefully it won't go quite as long, but I might skip over some details here and there. So comment below if you're confused or curious about any of my placements. I'm going to have a lot of controversial placings, but hey, it's just my list. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. So let's just get going with the ranking, starting off at my least favorite by a decent amount, and that is Jugulator. Now, Tim the Ripper Owens' era of Judas Priest is widely considered the worst era, and I half agree. I think Demolition is a fair amount better, which most people think Jugulator is the better of the two. I disagree. Now, this, for one, it's just not quite the Judas Priest style. It feels very much a product of the 90s. You can definitely tell the grunge influences and the Pantera influences. It's the heaviest album, so there's definitely some good, chonky, heavy riffs in here. But overall, just a lot of the lyrics and the songwriting are just trying too hard to be cool and hardcore and edgy. And it just doesn't fit with Priest. It doesn't fit with just being any good songs really at all. I mean, there's a couple all right songs here and there. I like Cathedral Spires, the end probably the most. There's also some other good parts of songs like Bloodstained, although that one's kind of cringy too. Death Row is all right, but for the most part, there's not too much good on this album. I think I said this was a really bad album when I first ranked this. This has grown on me a little bit as I kind of lean into some of the cheese and the try-hardy edginess of this, but overall, it's not very good. I think Demolition leans into the more melodic Priest elements a little bit better while keeping some of the more intense elements of the Tim the Ripper Owens era. Moving on to number 18, this is kind of here just by default, and that is Rola, their debut album. This is not a bad album for sure. It lags behind the others because it's probably the only non-metal album that Judas Priest has done. It's very much just like a fun rock album, but Judas Priest just hasn't quite gotten in their stride. They haven't quite found their unique identity. So overall, this comes out as just a little bit generic and not very re-listenable. There's a couple of fun songs in here, One for the Road and Rola. That one I think is a genuinely great song. But that's really the only two that I come back to in this album. The rest I think are just kind of boring, just kind of generic rock songs and not distinctly having that fun Priest elements at all. So not a bad album, but when it comes to Judas Priest, not good by any means. Moving on to number 17, I have got Point of Entry. Now, this album I find more than a little bit confusing because it happened during one of probably the golden era of Judas Priest. It's sandwiched right in between British Steel and Screaming for Vengeance, with Defenders of the Faith shortly after that. And this one, it's easy to forget that it even happened because it is so much worse in quality than those other two, where it's like albums like Rocka and even like Jugulator, like I understand why they're bad, because one, Rob Halford was gone, and one, they hadn't figured their style out yet. But this one just happened right off of their best album ever at the time, and it's just not good. It's incredibly just boring, generic. There's little to no interesting riffs or choruses or anything Priest would be known for later on. The one saving grace that I have for this album, usually people say Heading Out to the Highway is the best song in this album. I think it's Desert Plains, because I'm a sucker for some of those more just light, fun, ballady Priest songs. But Heading Out to the Highway is all right. Hot Rockin' is all right. But most of these songs, I mean, they're not atrocious, but they're just incredibly boring, generic. And I think the production, also re-listening to this album, the production feels really off, really I know, raw, but not in like a good, fun way, just kind of bad. So overall, this is a really shockingly not good Priest album. So that is point of entry at 17. Moving on to 16, I have the grand return of Rob Halford, and that is with Angel of Retribution. Now, I know a lot of people really love this album. I am most definitely not one of those people. I don't think it's a bad album by any means, but I think it's just like, yeah, it's all right. I mean, there's good songs on this, but there's not really any exceptional standouts. I would say maybe Loch Ness is the only really interesting one, even though I don't know why they wrote like, what is it, like a 13-minute song about the Loch Ness Monster, but it's pretty fun and interesting. There's some other decent ones. Demonizer is pretty cool. Angel and Judas Rising are all right, but the rest, not so much. It's a fairly short album, and I'd say only about half of the songs hit at all. So while it's nice to see Rob Halford return and for some nice, good, familiar material, it doesn't do anything to exactly, I don't know, stretch the boundary of what Priest can do and offer any like truly interesting new material. So overall, it becomes one of the more forgettable Priest albums. Moving on to number 15, I have got Ram It Down. This is another one of those kind of weird, forgettable albums, which kind of makes sense in this era. It was coming right off the back of Turbo, which is one of their most hated albums because it's just glam metal, and you're probably surprised that that one hasn't showed up yet, but we'll get there. But Ram It Down, this one kind of has an identity crisis because there was supposed to be like a Twin Turbos album, which was supposed to be like a pairing, like a sequel to Turbo that was supposed to be in that same kind of glam metal style. So half of that album was scrapped Twin Turbo stuff, and so it feels more glammy, and then the other half kind of feels more classic Judas Priest. So it's kind of going back and forth between that mishmash of tones, so there's not really a distinct, I don't know, quality or theme to this album that most Priest albums have. It's also pretty spotty in the quality overall. There's some good songs. My favorite is probably the title track, Ram It Down, just super catchy. I really like Blood Red Skies as well. Other songs like I'm a Rocker was all right. Monsters of Rock is all right. But once again, just like Angel of Retribution, it's about half and half. There's also a really weird and bad cover of Johnny Be Good. So like, it's not great. Once again, I think it's not bad. It's got a couple of gems within this album, but overall, this is definitely a very forgettable subpar Priest album. Moving on to number 14, a lot of people dislike this album as well, and that is Nostradamus. Now, what I will say, I think I had it higher last time. This one has come down to earth a little bit for me. I do respect the vision of what they were going for. There are no other just straight up concept albums that Priest has done. So I like the idea of having this one core theme of Nostradamus and just this long, fun, symphonic album that, you know, goes over the life and legacy of him. The problem is that I think they went a little bit in over their heads when it came to the length and the style of this album. It would have been nice if they had maybe like an hour-long album, you know, hour 15 would have been fine, but an hour 45 for an album, like I don't care what album it is, that's just way overkill. And so much of this, they had like almost half of the tracks with these just like short, like 2-minute little mini instrumentals that they could have easily cut. There's also a handful of songs that just kind of feel pointless and just for padding out the length. Now, I do like this album a fair amount more than most because I think a lot of the songs in this album actually work really well with the concept. A lot of it's got some good symphonic stuff and have just some really solid classic Priest choruses and riffs and are just really fun to return to. My favorite song is probably Visions. Other good ones, Prophecy, Nostradamus, Conquest, Alone, Future of Mankind. So there's a lot of actually really surprisingly good Priest songs that I think are overlooked. But as a whole, it's too long. There's a decent amount of bloat. It doesn't quite have the style that I prefer from Priest. But overall, I would say this is the first album where we're getting into the pretty good tier of Priest albums. Moving on to number 13, I have Killing Machine. or Hellbent for Leather, as it was known for a while in the US. But I think everybody calls it Killing Machine now. So yeah. Now this album, it kind of marks more of a shift away from like the 70s era, even though it's still 70s, but starting to get more towards like the British Steel style that they would go towards. And I would say this is kind of like a prototype for what they were going for with British Steel, just like kind of a not quite as refined and interesting version of that. It's got a decent amount of good songs, just not quite the consistency or the top quality that British Steel has. Some of the better ones, Hellbent for Leather, the title track, is great. Running Wild, Before the Dawn, Delivering the Goods are all really good. Burning Up is solid. But once again, the rest, not a huge fan of. It is definitely pretty hit or miss, and there aren't too many super high of highs. So while I know a lot of people really love this album, I'd say it's only just good, not quite great. Moving on. At number 12, the predecessor to Killing Machine, I have got Stained Class. This is probably my first really controversial opinion, but I will have plenty more of those on this list. I'm sorry. This is a lot of people's favorite Priest album, and probably there are definitely different categories of Priest fans. There are Priest fans who absolutely love their 70s material, your Sad Wings of Destiny, Sin After Sin, Stained Class in particular. And then there are those who, like me, who like their 80s stuff more than their 70s stuff. Although I do like a lot of their 70s stuff. You'll see there'd be more higher on this list. This one, I think, is a little bit overrated. There are some great songs, and then half of the rest, I think, are just kind of boring. This hasn't quite gotten to the style of Priest that I like yet, with the more anthemic, fun choruses, the more just fast-paced style that they would do later on. It's still got a little bit more of like a rock style to it. That just isn't quite my thing. But there are some really solid tracks on here. Probably the best one is Beyond the Realms of Death. That's just an excellent song. Better by You, Better Than Me is also great. Stained Class is also great. Exciter and Invader are decent songs, and the rest I don't really much care for. So once again, quality a little bit spotty. Half of it I really like, half of it I skip. And overall just not my style, but I understand why a lot of people love this one. Moving on, at number 11, right off the back of a controversial one, we've got another incredibly controversial pick, and that is Turbo at number 11. A lot of people absolutely hate this album with passion because this is when Judas Priest went glam. And for me, who didn't live during the glam era and listened to all of these albums basically at the same time, except for Invincible Shield, I have no bias towards that era, and I just found this album just really fun, catchy, lot of just classic Judas Priest choruses, some fun, fast-paced riffs, just everything I want from Judas Priest. Now, I will say, probably half of this album I think is absolutely excellent. The other half is, I understand the glam hate. It's a little bit too cheesy for me that I can't quite get into it. But the stuff that is good in this album is really good. Their title track, Turbo Lover, that is, I know, a classic to this day. I think they still played in concerts. Other good ones, Private Property, Out in the Cold, and probably my favorite one from this album is Hot for Love. I think all of those are really great songs that hold this album up, and I come back to those songs plenty of times. So overall, while they're definitely, I understand why people don't like this album, I think the hate for it is a little bit overblown. Overall, it's a solid album, and that's what I've got at 11. Moving on to number 10, now we're getting, I'd say this is still the good, we're not quite getting to the great albums, but this is a solid album, and that is Redeemer of Souls. Now, right off the heels of Angel of Retribution and Nostradamus, Judas Priest really had to prove that they could do something in this new era of Rob Halford, and I think this album was a good return to form, a good like demonstration of kind of a return to like that 80s sound, not trying to do anything too light or too crazy. This was just a fun, solid album. There's a lot of really good tracks on here. My favorites would be March of the Damned, Sword of Damocles, Beginning of the End is a fun ballad. There's also some decent ones, the title track, Halls of Valhalla, Hell and Back. So a lot of just solid tracks on this album, not too many misses. The problem with this album is it's really long, and there definitely is some bloat and some padding in here. There also isn't too many songs that really stick out. So while I think it's definitely a good album and showed that Priest were getting back into their old rhythm, I definitely wouldn't stick it up with the top tier of Priest. Moving on to number 9, now we're starting to get into some of the heavy hitters. We're already at 9, and I'd say from here we're definitely at the great albums, because we have got Sad Wings of Destiny. Another one that's a lot of people's favorites. This is kind of the album that cemented Priest as just the great band that they would become. This started shifting them more and more into the metal aspects, although it's still corely rooted in rock from Rola before, but we're getting there. And this album still has just got some of the most fun classic Priest songs to this day. My absolute favorite definitely is The Ripper, from which Tim the Ripper Owens took his name. Victim of Changes, a lot of people absolutely love and swear by that song. I don't get it. I think it's a alright song. I don't think it's a masterpiece by any means. Some other solid ones, Dream Deceiver, Tyrant is excellent, Epitaph and Isle of Domination. There's only like 9 songs, and I think most of them are pretty solid, and obviously the ones that are great are some all-time classics. Don't like it quite as much as most people, just because, once again, the 70s stuff isn't quite my preferred style of Priest, but this is still definitely a great album. Moving on to number 8, I have got Painkiller, another commonly cited favorite for a lot of people. I think I had this one even lower last time. This one has grown on me over time. This is probably the most high-pitched album that Rob Halford has done. It's the most he's got the best screams in this one. Obviously, the title track, Painkiller, is an absolute classic, but there's a lot of good stuff besides that. All Guns Blazing, Leather Rebel, Metal Meltdown, Nightcrawler. My second favorite is probably Between the Hammer and the Anvil. So a decent amount of really solid tracks. There is a handful of tracks that I don't much care for, which is why this isn't too much higher, but it's got some absolute classics in here. But I think probably the title track, Painkiller, is what really puts it up this high. If it didn't have Painkiller, I'd say it'd be not quite as good as I think most people would put it, but overall definitely still a classic Priest album, and number 8 for me overall. Moving on to number 7, I have got my last of the 70s era, my favorite of Priest's 70s era, and that is Sin After Sin. Most people will go to Stained Class or Sad Wings of Destiny for their favorite 70s Priest, and this is my favorite. I think it is just the most consistent in terms of quality. There's maybe only one song that I skip in this album. It's not any higher than 7 because the songs that are great aren't as great as some of the higher ones. And once again, I don't prefer the style as much, but it's really good. It's got some absolute classics on here. Raw Deal and Dissident Aggressor are probably my 2 favorite off the album. Sinner is really good. Diamonds and Rust cover is excellent. Starbreaker is really good. Call for the Priest. So solid, consistent quality, some absolute gems on there too. So really good album overall. Sin After Sin at 7. Moving on to number 6, I have got British Steel. Often cited as the best Judas Priest album. I would disagree. I think it's really good, and this was the natural evolution of Killing Machine. This is basically Killing Machine, but done bigger, better, more interesting, more consistent in its style, and obviously it's got some of the most classic Priest songs overall. Breaking the Law is probably their most famous song. I think that song is a little overrated. I genuinely think it's just all right. Living After Midnight, on the other hand, I love that song. That's one of my favorite Priest songs. Some other more slept-on songs that are really good, Grinder and Rapid Fire are excellent. Some other good ones like Metal Gods and You Don't Have to Be Old to Be Wise. Now, I think this album overall is a little bit overrated because people like Breaking the Law more than I think they should. And also, I think the latter half has a few skippable tracks. So while it's still a great album, still an absolute classic, I can't put it any higher than 6. Moving on to number 5. Here's probably my most controversial opinion of the list, but who knows, we'll see. At 5, I've got Demolition. Now, if you have watched my previous Judas Priest albums ranked, I put this at number 2. So yes, I am a little bit insane because I think I'm in the category of maybe the 3 people on this earth who like Demolition this much. Yeah, obviously I don't like it as much as last time, but there is just still a lot of really good stuff in this album. As I said before, this takes the Tim the Ripper Owens style, makes it a little bit more melodic, gives it more of those Priest elements that really stick with me, but it still has its own very distinct and unique style. And a lot of these songs are just a lot of fun. Some of them are still have that kind of cringy jugulator style, but I like the way they do this more. I can't tell you exactly what it is. Some of my favorite ones off this album, Metal Messiah and Cyberface, are my 2 absolute favorite. I love those songs. Feed on Me, Close to You, One on One, Lost and Found, Subterfuge. I mean, this is a long album, and honestly, I like most of them. There's a handful of pretty mediocre, skippable tracks, but most Priest albums have a few of those. I just think this album is really fun, really consistent in its quality, and incredibly underrated. But obviously, I am a little bit insane, so yeah, take that as you will. Moving on to number 4, I have got Defenders of the Faith. Another common pick for people's favorite. And I think this is probably, one of the 2 of like the best era for Priest, is coming right hot off the heels of Screaming for Vengeance. And this might as well be Screaming for Vengeance 2.0. It's a great album. It's got some of the best Priest songs of all time. It's got my favorite Priest song of all time, that being The Sentinel. It's got other great ones like Rock Hard, Ride Free, Jawbreaker, Free Will Burning, Love Bites, Some Heads Are Gonna Roll. Most of these songs are good. There's a couple of songs near the end that I think are not as great. I think there's only like 10 songs in this album total, and I think the last one or maybe the first one are just like an intro or outro, so it's really more like 9. So it's a short album, so even though it's filled with mostly great songs, it still doesn't have as much as other Priest albums, so those albums have more songs to build up a bigger catalog of greats, so that's why I don't put this any higher, but obviously it's still classic, still a fabulous album. Moving on, these next 3 are all very close. These next 2 in particular, I could swap them back and forth. I debated, but this is where I'm landing. At number 3, I have got Firepower. Now, Firepower, and basically the most recent Judas Priest albums, maybe it's recency bias, but obviously I listened to all of these albums just like a year or so ago, so it wasn't recency bias when this came out, and I think this is basically Firepower and also Invincible Shield, I think, are basically just a continuation of the greatness from the 80s, the Defenders of the Faith and Screaming for Vengeance. I don't know how Priest has still got it in their old age, but they absolutely do. Some of my absolute favorite Priest songs are on this album. That would be Lightning Strike, No Surrender, Firepower, Necromancer, Rising from Ruins. Honestly, there's like 14 songs in this album, and I think only like 1 or 2 are ones that I would skip. So it's a long album, but it's incredibly consistent. It's got some top tier Priest songs, and it's just spectacular. Likewise, my number 2 pick, which is Invincible Shield, has a very similar quality and is just as good, and obviously I think a teeny bit better than Firepower. Recency bias, maybe, but I absolutely love this album, as you can see. It's got some fantastic tracks. It's 11 long. There's no bloat in this album. There's probably like Firepower, there's one, maybe two that I don't so much care for, but basically every other song ranges from good to great. And why I give this the edge just over Firepower is between the two, my favorite song between those two albums comes from this album, and that is Panic Attack. I think that goes toe to toe with some of the heaviest hitters that Priest has done. It's like a different version of Painkiller almost. It's absolutely spectacular and my favorite off the album. But there's some other great songs from this album. The Serpent and the King, maybe my second favorite. That's another absolutely spectacular song. Trial by Fire is great. Giants in the Sky is great. There's some other solid ones. Devil in Disguise, Gates of Hell, Is God Is My Witness, Escape from Reality. So once again, probably 9 out of these 11 tracks are really good Priest songs, and even the ones that I would skip, I wouldn't say are bad songs by any means, just not especially standouts. So it's just amazing to me how Priest continues to be so great and pushing the boundaries and trying new stuff while staying true to their style and harkening back to times of old. But like, man, this is just, it's impressive how good this album is. And honestly, for a bit, I almost considered it at my top spot, but I know that would be blasphemy. But who knows? I have a ton of crazy picks. Maybe one day we'll take over the top spot. But not today, because at number 1, I have Screaming for Vengeance, probably the most quintessential Priest album, in my opinion. This is Judas Priest at their best, in their peak era, and every song in this album, except for Pain and Pleasure, are not just good, but are absolutely great classic Priest songs. You can just go right down the list. Starts off Hellion and the Electric Eye, Riding on the Wind, Bloodstone, Take These Chains, which that one I think is super underrated. Obviously the title track, Screaming for Vengeance, the radio friendly, You Got Another Thing Coming, which is still a great song in its own right. Fever and Devil's Child. So just an incredibly consistent Priest album. It's got a lot of different styles of Priest songs, but every single one of them, except for the one, works very well. So not just one of the best Priest albums, but one of the all-time classic metal albums, in my opinion, and that is coming in at my number 1 spot. So let me know which picks did you agree and disagree with. Comment below how you would rank the 19 Judas Priest albums. Let me know what other videos, metal rankings you'd like to see in the future. At some point, I'm probably going to be doing Blind Guardian and Catatonia, but who knows when that's going to be. I'm in my last semester at college, so uploads will be sporadic, but thank you so much for everybody who stuck in there and supported me. If we ever get to 500 subs, might be a couple years, a couple decades, then I'll do a cool video like my top 50 favorite metal albums or something like that. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.